Big Shaq thought he had seen struggle, until the night he followed an elderly janitor into the shadows. A man who had spent his life working double shifts, yet was still begging for food. What Shaq uncovered wasn't just one man's hardship. It was a system designed to break people. The deeper he dug, the darker the truth became, and powerful enemies were waiting. Would he risk everything to fight back? Or would the forces in power silence him before he could? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The world knew Big Shaq as the larger-than-life basketball legend, the towering businessman who turned his name into an empire. But beyond the glitz, the multi-million-dollar endorsements, and the flashing cameras, there was a man who still saw the world through the eyes of a kid from Newark. A kid who had seen struggle up close and never wanted to forget it. Shaq had it all. He had money that could buy anything, influence that could move industries, and fame that made him instantly recognizable wherever he went. But deep inside, something gnawed at him. A question he could never fully answer. Was he doing enough? He gave to charity, sure. He visited hospitals, wrote checks, funded scholarships. Yet every time he walked through the bustling streets of any American city, he saw the same thing. People struggling, invisible figures trying to survive in a world that had long given up on them. He never talked about it, but those images stuck with him. The single mother working 2 jobs who still had to choose between rent and food. The old man sweeping floors at 3 a.m. because his retirement fund had run dry. The young kid with holes in his shoes, eyes full of dreams, but hands empty of opportunity. These were the stories that haunted him. And no amount of money in his bank account could silence the guilt of knowing that despite all his success, the world hadn't changed for people like them. That night, as he sat in his penthouse suite overlooking the city's skyline, Shaq's mind was restless. He had just left a high-profile charity gala, an event where billionaires patted each other on the back for donating fractions of their wealth. The air had been thick with self-congratulation, the kind that left a bad taste in his mouth. He had given his speech, posed for photos, and signed a check. Another 6-figure donation that would make headlines but change nothing. He exhaled, rubbing his hands together, a habit he had whenever his thoughts ran too deep. He had been here before. This crossroads between being comfortable and doing something real. His mother, Lucille, had raised him to be more than just a man with money. She had taught him to be a man of purpose. But how? How do you fix a world that refuses to change? The sound of distant sirens pulled him from his thoughts. He glanced at his watch, just past midnight. He felt restless, like he needed to see something real, something that didn't come with red carpets and scripted conversations. Throwing on a hoodie and a cap, he took the elevator down to the lobby. No security, no entourage, just him. It was something he did often. Walk the city, see it for what it was when no one was watching. As he stepped outside, the crisp night air greeted him, carrying the distant hum of life moving on. Cars honking, street vendors closing shop, people rushing home from late shifts. He moved quietly, blending into the shadows, his massive frame the only thing that made him stand out. Shaq had always been fascinated by the people who worked when the world was asleep, the ones whose names no one remembered, but whose hands kept the city running. And that's when he saw him. An elderly janitor, maybe in his 70s, hunched over as he mopped the sidewalk outside a 24-hour diner. His uniform was faded, his movements slow but deliberate, like a man who had done this 1,000 times before. Shaq recognized him. He had seen him before, at one of the stadiums, cleaning up after the crowds had left. A quiet, invisible figure in the background of Shaq's world. But here, outside this diner, he looked different. Tired. Defeated. Hungry. Shaq watched as the old man leaned against the wall, rubbing his aching back before hesitantly stepping inside the diner. He followed, slipping into a seat near the counter, pretending to scroll through his phone as he observed. The old man approached the cashier, speaking in a hushed voice, but Shaq heard every word. "Do you have any leftovers? Anything y'all gonna throw out?" The cashier, a young woman barely out of her teens, hesitated before shaking her head. "I'm sorry, sir. We're not allowed to give out food after closing." The man nodded, his face unreadable, but Shaq caught the way his shoulders dropped just slightly, the way he swallowed hard, forcing himself to accept yet another rejection. The janitor turned to leave, his steps heavier than before. Shaq felt something tighten in his chest. A man who had worked double shifts should never have to beg for food. He didn't think, he just acted. Shaq rose from his seat, moving toward the cashier. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice low. "Whatever he was going to order, put it on me. And give him extra." The girl's eyes widened as she recognized him, but Shaq put a finger to his lips. "Keep it between us, okay?" She nodded quickly, ringing up the order as Shaq turned toward the door. But by the time he stepped outside, the old man was gone. Shaq scanned the street, searching for the faded uniform, the slow shuffle of tired feet. Nothing. It was like the man had vanished into the night. A strange feeling settled over Shaq. He had seen struggle before. But this was something else. He didn't know it yet, but that moment, that one brief encounter, was about to change everything. Because Shaq wasn't the type to let a question go unanswered. And right now, he had one haunting him. Why was a man who had spent his life working still begging for food? That was a question that needed an answer. And Shaq was going to find it. The day had been long. One of those days that felt like a lifetime wrapped in 24 hours. Big Shaq had spent the morning in meetings, the afternoon at a charity event, and the evening on a talk show where he was expected to smile, crack jokes, and talk about his latest business venture. Cameras flashed, people clapped, and every interaction felt like a well-rehearsed script. Now, as the night settled over the city, he sat in the back seat of his black SUV, staring out at the passing streets, exhaustion pressing against his bones. His driver, Lenny, a man Shaq had known for years, glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "You good, big man?" Lenny asked, his voice carrying that mix of casual concern and familiarity. Shaq nodded but said nothing. His mind was somewhere else, replaying the moment from earlier that day. The janitor. It had been at the stadium just before Shaq's charity event began. The place had been buzzing with staff and guests, a mix of high-profile names and everyday people who had been invited to witness the generosity of the rich and famous. But amid the chaos, Shaq had noticed him. The elderly janitor. The man had been moving slowly, a mop in one hand, his other gripping the handle of a supply cart as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. His face, lined with exhaustion, was one Shaq felt he had seen before, maybe at another event, another stadium. He wasn't sure. What he was sure of, though, was that no one else had noticed him. Not the guests, dressed in their designer suits and expensive watches. Not the reporters, busy preparing their cameras and scripts. Not even the event organizers, who prided themselves on making sure everything was perfect. Shaq had watched as the janitor wiped sweat from his forehead with the sleeve of his faded uniform before disappearing through a side door. The moment had stuck with him. And now, hours later, as Shaq's SUV rolled past a small 24-hour diner, his eyes caught something that made him sit up. The same janitor. But this time, he wasn't working. He was standing outside the diner, his back slightly hunched, his hands fidgeting near his pockets. The streetlights cast long shadows, stretching his figure across the sidewalk like a ghost of the man he once was. Shaq's gut tightened. "Lenny, pull over." Lenny gave him a look but didn't argue. The SUV eased toward the curb, and Shaq quickly stepped out, pulling his hood up. He didn't want attention. He just wanted to see. From a few feet away, Shaq watched as the old man hesitated before stepping inside the diner. Through the glass windows, Shaq saw him approach the counter, speaking to a young cashier. Their conversation was short, and then, defeat. The janitor turned, shoulders slumped, and walked out. Shaq's feet moved before he could think. The old man walked down the street, his pace slow, as if his body was arguing with every step. Shaq followed at a distance, his mind racing with questions. Why was a man who had worked all day, probably a double shift, walking home hungry? The janitor didn't go far. Just a couple of blocks down, he turned into a dimly lit alleyway, disappearing behind a building. Shaq hesitated for only a second before following. The alley was quiet. the kind of quiet that felt wrong in a city that never truly slept. Trash cans lined the walls, and the faint sound of a distant car horn echoed in the background. And then, he saw it. A small door, half hidden by shadows, slightly ajar. Shaq moved closer, his heart thudding just a little harder in his chest. He could hear voices inside, low murmurs, tired sighs. And then, the sound of something scraping against the floor. A chair? A crate? He wasn't sure. He peered through the crack of the door. Inside, the janitor sat on the floor, surrounded by others. Not many, maybe 5, maybe 6. All elderly, all dressed in the same worn-out uniforms. Some were janitors like him. Others wore faded fast food uniforms, their name tags barely hanging on. And in the center of them all, a small brown paper bag sat on the floor. One of the women, her hands shaking from either exhaustion or age, reached into the bag and pulled out half a sandwich. She broke it into smaller pieces and passed them around. Shaq's throat tightened. They weren't just sharing a meal, they were rationing scraps. The janitor, the same man who had been cleaning up after people all day, the man who had been ignored by an entire stadium full of guests, was now sitting on a cold floor, splitting half a sandwich with others just like him. Shaq had seen poverty before. He had grown up in neighborhoods where struggle was a way of life. But this was something else entirely. This wasn't just struggle. This was the world forgetting its own people. Shaq exhaled slowly, stepping back from the door. His mind was spinning, anger simmering beneath the surface. Not the kind of anger that made a man lash out, but the kind that settled deep in his chest, waiting for the right moment to be unleashed. For a long moment he stood there, staring at the door, fists clenched at his sides. He had spent years donating money, funding programs, giving speeches about change. But what good were speeches when men like this janitor still had to beg for food after working themselves to the bone? What good was money when it never reached the people who needed it the most? Shaq turned and walked back toward the street, his footsteps heavier than before. This wasn't over. Not even close. He wasn't sure what he was going to do yet. But one thing was clear. He couldn't ignore this. Shaq had spent his life on courts under the brightest lights, in boardrooms where billions were at stake, on stages where cameras captured his every move. But tonight, in the dimly lit back streets of the city, he was just another man walking behind a shadow, one that no one else seemed to notice. He kept his hood low, hands tucked into his jacket pockets, blending in as much as a 7-foot 1-inch giant could. His mind raced as he followed the janitor's slow, unsteady steps. The man walked with the weight of a lifetime pressing down on his back, his thin frame swallowed by the oversized jacket that did little to protect him from the cold. Shaq had seen exhaustion before, on teammates after grueling games, on single mothers working 3 jobs, on young kids hustling to make it out of nowhere. But this was different. This was hopeless exhaustion, the kind that didn't expect things to ever get better. The janitor turned down another street, heading toward the industrial side of town. The roads were quieter here, the sidewalks cracked and uneven. No neon lights, no high-end stores, just old warehouses and run-down buildings, forgotten by time. And then Shaq saw where the man was going. Up ahead stood a building that looked abandoned, its walls weathered, its windows dark. The kind of place most people would walk past without a second glance. There was no sign, no indication that anyone lived there, but the janitor walked toward it like he had done it 100 times before. Shaq slowed his steps as the man reached the door, a rusted metal entrance covered in scratches and faded paint. The janitor knocked twice, then waited. A pause. Then the door creaked open just enough for him to slip inside. Shaq's gut tightened. This wasn't a shelter. It wasn't a halfway house. This was something else. He moved closer, pressing himself against the side of the building, his breath steady despite the unease creeping in. He waited a few beats, making sure no one was watching, then edged toward the door. It was slightly ajar, just like before. Voices. Muffled. Tired. Some barely above a whisper. Shaq leaned in, careful not to push the door further open. Inside he could make out 6, maybe 7 people, all elderly. all wearing uniforms of different kinds: fast food, janitorial, security guards. Their faces were lined with exhaustion, their bodies slumped against makeshift seats, old crates, a broken couch, the floor itself. A single lantern flickered in the middle of the room, casting long, tired shadows against the cracked walls. The janitor sat near the center, pulling off his gloves slowly, his fingers stiff with cold. "Anything?" someone asked, voice thin, weary. The janitor shook his head. "Number same as last night." A collective silence followed. A silence Shaq recognized. The silence of people used to disappointment. One of the men, a former security guard judging by his uniform, sighed and rubbed his hands together. "They're cracking down. Won't even give leftovers anymore." "Not like we ever got much," a woman muttered. Shaq's chest tightened. They weren't just homeless, they were workers, people who had jobs. And yet, here they were, rationing scraps in a freezing room. It didn't make sense. He had spent his life believing in hard work, discipline, grinding until you made it. But these people had done all that, and it still hadn't been enough. Shaq exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold. He wasn't sure how long he had been standing there, listening to their quiet conversations, but the weight in his chest was getting heavier by the second. Then he heard something that made his stomach drop. "We might have to stop working." It came from an older man in a worn-out janitor's uniform, his face lined with deep wrinkles. He wasn't saying it out of frustration or protest. He was saying it like a doctor delivering bad news. The woman beside him frowned. "And do what?" "We stop working. We lose everything." The old man shook his head. "We have nothing now." Silence. No one argued, because he was right. Shaq stepped back, suddenly aware of the night's cold pressing against his skin. He had followed the janitor expecting to find a man down on his luck. He had found something much bigger. This wasn't just one man's struggle. It was a system breaking people down, one shift at a time. And Shaq, for the first time in a long time, didn't know what to do. Shaq had spent his entire life believing that hard work paid off. He had seen it firsthand, his mother, Lucille, working tirelessly to raise him, instilling in him the values of discipline, respect, and perseverance. He had lived by those principles, built his empire on them, and prided himself on being a man who understood struggle. But standing outside that crumbling building, listening to the hushed voices of elderly workers with nothing to show for a lifetime of labor, he felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just struggle. This was survival. He inhaled deeply, pressing his back against the cold brick wall as he listened. The people inside weren't talking about dreams or ambitions. They weren't complaining about jobs they hated or wishing for vacations they'd never take. They were talking about making it through the next week. Shaq took a step closer, careful not to let the door creak. He could see them now, their faces illuminated by the weak glow of a single lantern. The janitor he had followed, the one who had been denied food despite working double shifts, sat near the center. Someone spoke his name. Robert Bobby Trenton. A name that sounded too strong for a man who looked so worn down. Shaq's jaw tightened. Bobby's hands trembled as he rubbed his palms together for warmth. His uniform, faded and stained from years of use, hung loosely on his thin frame. He looked like a man who had given everything and had nothing left. A woman beside him, her hair pulled into a tight bun, handed him half a sandwich. "Eat, Bobby." He shook his head. "Not tonight, Ruth. You didn't eat all day." Neither of them moved for a long moment. Then, with a sigh, Ruth tore the sandwich in half again and placed the smaller piece in his hand. "Then neither of us eat." Bobby hesitated, then took a slow bite, chewing like a man who wanted to make it last. Shaq felt his fists clench at his sides. This man, this worker, was rationing half a sandwich like it was a luxury meal. And yet, earlier that same day, Shaq had been at a charity event where executives drank champagne that cost more than Bobby probably made in a month. His stomach churned. Then Bobby spoke, his voice tired, but steady. "They're not letting us take leftovers anymore," he said, looking at the group around him. "New management says it makes the business look bad, like they ain't paying us enough." A hollow chuckle rippled through the room, but there was no humor in it. "They ain't paying us enough. someone muttered. Bobby exhaled sharply. They say we should be grateful for the hours we get. But tell me, what's a man supposed to do with 30 hours a week at minimum wage? Pay rent? Eat? Keep the lights on? The room fell silent. Bobby shook his head, his fingers tightening around the remains of his sandwich. I worked at that place for damn near 20 years. Thought if I stuck it out long enough, I'd get a real pension. Thought maybe, just maybe, I'd be able to retire with some dignity. He let out a bitter laugh. You know what I got instead? Cut hours, no benefits, and a pink slip right before my 59th birthday. Shaq felt his stomach drop. 59. Too young for Social Security. Too old to start over. I tried finding something else, Bobby continued, his voice rough with exhaustion. Took whatever shifts I could. Janitor at the stadium. Night shifts at the mall. A little security work, but they don't want old men guarding their fancy stores. He looked down at his hands. Hands that had spent decades scrubbing floors, moving crates, cleaning up after people who never gave him a second glance. Now? I live here, Bobby said simply, motioning around the dimly lit space. With the rest of them, the ones who worked until their bodies gave out, the ones who spent years building this city, serving its people, and got nothing in return. Shaq swallowed hard. He scanned the faces in the room, each one a story, each one a life reduced to this. A woman in a faded waitress uniform, her hands rough from years of scrubbing dishes, now too weak to hold a tray. A former factory worker with a limp from an injury that never healed, fired the moment he became too slow for the assembly line. A security guard who had spent decades protecting people who never even knew his name, now left unprotected himself. Shaq had seen people struggle before, but he had never seen this. This wasn't just bad luck. This was the system failing the very people who kept it running. His chest felt heavy, his breath slow and deliberate. He had spent years giving back, or at least he thought he had. He had donated millions to charities, built schools, funded scholarships. But none of that mattered to these people, because they weren't looking for scholarships. They weren't looking for charity handouts. They were looking for basic human dignity. A chance to rest after decades of work, a roof over their heads, a meal they didn't have to beg for. Shaq took a slow step back, his mind racing. He couldn't just walk away from this. He wasn't sure what he was going to do yet. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let Bobby Trenton become just another invisible worker. And he damn sure wasn't going to let this story end here. Shaq stood in the shadows, his broad shoulders tensed, his mind spinning. He had spent his entire career believing in hard work, discipline, and perseverance. That if you pushed forward, no matter how tough things got, success would eventually follow. But here, in this dimly lit room filled with men and women who had given their lives to labor, he saw a different reality. Bobby sat with his back against the peeling wall, his hands resting on his knees, his fingers calloused and stiff from decades of work. His eyes, once sharp, now dulled by exhaustion, held stories Shaq wasn't sure he was ready to hear. But he needed to hear them. The room was silent except for the faint hum of a passing car outside. The others in the shelter sat close, their faces lined with the same exhaustion Bobby carried, as if they had all been through the same war. Then, Bobby exhaled deeply and began. I was 16 when I got my first real job, he said, his voice hoarse but steady. Dishwasher at a diner in Jackson, Mississippi. Back then, we didn't have much of a choice. If you were young and black, you either worked, joined the service, or ended up in trouble. He glanced at the others, nodding as if they had all lived this truth. I chose work. Started with dishes, then bussing tables, then cooking when they needed extra hands. Never missed a shift. Never showed up late. Thought if I worked hard enough, one day I'd move up, maybe even run my own place. He paused, the corners of his mouth twitching into something that wasn't quite a smile. But that's not how it worked. Shaq leaned forward, listening closely. The owner, white guy, always wore these slick suits like he was somebody important. Used to tell me, Bobby, you're one of my best workers, fastest hands in the kitchen. Said it like a compliment, like I should be grateful. Bobby shook his head. But when the head cook left, you know who got promoted? A white kid straight out of high school. Ain't never cooked a day in his life. Shaq clenched his jaw. He had seen it before. Talented, hard-working black men being passed over for people with half their skill, simply because of the color of their skin. Still, I swallowed it, kept my head down, figured maybe it was just bad luck. Moved on to factory work, real labor. 16-hour shifts, sweating through my clothes, lifting crates so heavy I couldn't feel my arms by the time I got home. But at least it paid. Bobby let out a slow breath. Then came the layoffs. Shaq didn't need to hear the rest to know what happened next. They told us they were restructuring. That was their word for it. But every single man they let go looked just like me. Bobby's fingers curled slightly, his knuckles turning white. I remember standing in that office, staring at the manager while he lied to my face. Said it wasn't personal, that they just had to make tough decisions. Meanwhile, every white worker in that damn place kept their job. The room remained still. Shaq knew this wasn't just Bobby's story. This was the story of generations. Bobby rubbed his temple, as if the memories physically pained him. I found another job. Then another. Then another. That's how it went. Always moving, always starting over. Every time I got close to something steady, something worth keeping, it got taken from me. His voice dropped lower, heavier. Then one day I hit 45, and everything changed. No one wanted to hire an old man anymore. Shaq inhaled sharply. 45 wasn't old. Not in the NBA, not in business, not in life. But for a black man in the labor force, it was a death sentence. I tried to fight it, Bobby continued. Went back to school, learned new skills, even took some damn computer classes. Thought maybe if I proved myself again, I could find something steady. He shook his head, laughing bitterly. You know what they told me? That I didn't have enough experience in the new industry, that I was too old to train. Shaq's stomach twisted. Bobby's eyes darkened. I wasn't too old to work in a warehouse. Wasn't too old to scrub their floors. Wasn't too old to clean up after their damn kids in these stadiums. But the moment I asked for something better, something that didn't break my back, suddenly, I was worthless. A heavy silence settled in the room. Bobby exhaled, the sound ragged. I spent my whole life being told if I worked hard enough, I'd be rewarded. That's the lie they sold us. His gaze lifted, locking onto Shaq's. But the truth is, for men like me, the game was rigged before we even stepped on the court. Shaq felt something tighten in his chest. He thought about his own journey, how different it had been. Yes, he had worked hard. Yes, he had sacrificed. But he had also been one of the lucky ones. He had talent that couldn't be ignored, a platform that gave him power, money that shielded him from the realities Bobby had lived through. But what if things had been different? What if he hadn't been Big Shaq? What if he had been Bobby Trenton? The thought made him feel uneasy. Bobby leaned back against the wall, his expression unreadable. You want to know what hurts the most? Shaq nodded, his throat tight. I did everything right. I never took shortcuts, never stole, never hurt nobody. I gave the best years of my life to jobs that chewed me up and spit me out. And now, at 72, I got nothing. The weight of his words settled over Shaq like a crushing force. No savings, no home, no family left. Just this. Bobby motioned around the shelter, his eyes tired. This is all that's left for us. Shaq swallowed hard. Bobby had been taught the same lesson every black man in America was taught. Work twice as hard, be twice as good, and you'll get half as much. And now, here he was, with even less than that. Shaq knew he couldn't change the past. He couldn't rewrite Bobby's life or erase the injustices he had endured. But one thing was clear. He couldn't walk away from this, not anymore. Shaq had always believed in fixing things with action. If he saw a problem, he solved it. If someone needed help, he stepped up. That's how he had built his empire, by making decisions and making them fast. But this was different. This wasn't about writing a check. This wasn't about sponsoring a few meals or donating to a charity that would pat him on the back and move on. This was bigger. As he sat in his penthouse, the city lights sprawling beneath him, Bobby's words echoed in his mind. No savings, no home, no family left. Just this. Shaq had spent years giving back. He had built schools, funded businesses, helped families who had fallen on hard times. But those were band-aids on a bullet wound. What happened to Bobby, and thousands of others like him, wasn't just bad luck. It was a system designed to chew people up and leave them with nothing. The more Shaq thought about it, the angrier he got. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't a journalist. But he had money, power, and a voice big enough to shake the ground. And he was going to use them. Digging deeper. The next morning, Shaq made some calls. He started with business owners he trusted, people who had built companies from the ground up, men and women who had seen success but hadn't lost their integrity. He asked them one question: why are people like Bobby still struggling after decades of work? Some gave vague answers, some danced around the topic, but one man, an old friend from his early business days, finally told him the truth. "Shaq, you really want to know why?" The man sighed over the phone. "Because it's designed that way. Cheap labor keeps businesses running. These companies don't want workers who can retire. They want workers who'll be desperate enough to take whatever they can get." Shaq gripped his phone tighter. "You're telling me this is on purpose?" "I'm telling you that poverty is profitable, big man." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Shaq spent the next 2 weeks making quiet moves. He reached out to former employees, labor rights advocates, investigative journalists, anyone who had spent years looking at the system from the inside. What he found was worse than he had imagined. A network of corporations, fast food chains, cleaning services, security firms, and factories, all relying on underpaid, overworked employees who had no benefits, no pensions, and no real way out. Many of them, just like Bobby, had worked their whole lives for nothing. And the worst part? These companies knew exactly what they were doing. They cut hours just low enough to avoid giving benefits. They delayed raises until workers quit from frustration. They exploited older employees until they physically couldn't work anymore, then replaced them with younger, cheaper labor. And no one was stopping them. Shaq sat in his home office, staring at the documents in front of him. News articles, employee testimonies, financial reports. It was all there. Proof. The cost of speaking up. Shaq knew that if he exposed this, it wouldn't go unnoticed. He wasn't just some random guy. He was Big Shaq, a millionaire, a businessman, a public figure with a global audience. If he went after these corporations, it wouldn't just be headlines. It would be war. His sponsors? Some of them had ties to these companies. His business partners? Many of them had shares in the very corporations profiting off this system. If he spoke up, he could lose deals, lose endorsements, lose millions. But what was the alternative? Do nothing? Let Bobby and the thousands of other forgotten workers fade away while the rich kept getting richer? Shaq exhaled, rubbing his hands together. He had faced tough choices before, but this was different. This wasn't just about his career. This was about doing the right thing, no matter the cost. The next morning, he picked up his phone and made the call. The threats begin. Shaq had been in the public eye his whole life, but he had never seen anything like what happened next. It started small, a few warning emails, anonymous messages telling him to mind his own business. Then came the calls from people he had once trusted. "Shaq, this isn't your fight. Be careful, man. These companies have power. You really want to lose millions over some workers you don't even know?" Shaq ignored them. Then the real threats started. An untraceable number called his phone late at night. A distorted voice on the other end. "Back off." A letter, no name, no return address, arrived at his office. "You don't know who you're messing with. Walk away." Shaq wasn't scared easily. He had spent years in the toughest arenas, facing the biggest names in the game. But this wasn't a game. This was powerful people trying to silence him, and that only made him more determined. A decision that could change everything. Shaq sat in his office, staring at his laptop screen. On the screen was a drafted statement, one that would expose everything he had found. He knew what would happen the moment he hit send. It would be war. He could lose deals, lose money, lose friends. But then he thought about Bobby. He thought about that half-eaten sandwich in the shelter. He thought about the workers who had been chewed up and spat out by a system that never cared about them. And suddenly, The decision wasn't so hard. Shaq took a deep breath and pressed send. Shaq had never been the type to sit still when he saw something wrong. It wasn't in his nature to ignore problems, especially not when people's lives were at stake. But this wasn't just a problem. This was a system built to break people. And now, it had a new problem of its own. Big Shaq wasn't backing down. The first move, calling out the giants. The morning after Shaq sent out his statement, the internet exploded. His words were everywhere. Companies are getting rich while their workers starve. The system is broken, and it's time we fix it. Hardworking people like Bobby Trenton deserve more than just empty promises. It wasn't just another celebrity rant. It was a direct call-out. Shaq named names. He pointed fingers at the corporations profiting off low wages, stolen pensions, and rigged contracts. And the world listened. News outlets picked up the story. Social media caught fire. And within hours, workers from all over the country began sharing their own stories. A retired factory worker in Ohio, a former cashier in Texas, a janitor in New York. All of them had the same message. We worked. We gave everything. And we got nothing in return. For the first time, people were paying attention, and the companies, they panicked. The pushback begins. Within 24 hours, Shaq's inbox was flooded with messages from executives, lawyers, and PR teams scrambling to contain the damage. Some tried to act concerned. Shaq, let's talk privately. We can fix this together. Others were more direct. You're making a mistake. You don't understand how business works. And then, there were the threats, anonymous calls, letters with no return addresses, the same message over and over, back off. Shaq didn't care. He had been threatened before. He had faced off against giants his entire career, on the court, in business, in life. This was just another fight, and he wasn't going to lose. The second move, buying back power. Shaq knew that calling out the system wasn't enough. He needed to change it, so he did something that no one saw coming. He started buying out struggling businesses, the same ones that had been forced to cut wages and lay off workers just to survive. Fast food franchises, security firms, cleaning services. And once he owned them, he changed everything. Higher wages, full benefits, retirement plans. It wasn't just about helping a few workers. It was about proving a point. The same companies that had claimed they couldn't afford to pay workers fairly, Shaq was running them at a profit while paying people what they deserved. And once that news got out, other business owners started following his lead. Small restaurants, grocery stores, local businesses that had always wanted to pay more but had been scared of going under. They saw what Shaq was doing and joined the movement. And just like that, the system started to crack. The third move, exposing the corruption. Shaq knew that changing a few businesses wasn't enough. He had to destroy the foundation of the system itself. So, he went after the truth. Through quiet back channels, he hired investigative journalists, some of the best in the country. They dug into corporate tax records. They found hidden policies that kept wages low. They uncovered manipulated contracts, unpaid pensions, and illegal loopholes that companies used to trap workers in cycles of poverty. And when the reports were finished, Shaq made sure the world saw them. Leaked documents, internal memos, secret recordings, proof that these companies had been lying all along. By the time the headlines dropped, it was too late for damage control. The public was outraged, workers protested, customers boycotted. The same executives who had once laughed off the issue were now scrambling to save their reputations. But for some, it was already too late. The backlash. When Power Fights Back, Shaq knew this was coming. You don't shake the system without consequences. First, business partners started pulling out. Some of his biggest sponsors dropped him without warning. Too controversial. Bad for business. Then came the lawsuits. Companies sued him for defamation. Politicians accused him of inciting unrest. Media outlets, once eager to cover his story, started shifting the narrative. Is Shaquille O'Neal too radical? Is this a business revolution or just a publicity stunt? The pressure was building. Even people close to him, friends, advisors, partners, started urging him to stop. "Shaq, this is getting dangerous. You did enough. Walk away while you can." But Shaq wasn't listening, because this wasn't about him anymore. This was about every worker who had been silenced, every Bobby Trenton, every man and woman who had worked their whole lives, only to be left with nothing. So, despite the losses, despite the attacks, despite the entire system trying to shut him down, Shaq kept pushing, and that's when something happened that no one expected. The people started fighting back too. Workers began demanding higher wages. Unions that had been silenced for decades started speaking out. Politicians who had once ignored the issue felt the pressure to act. Shaq had started a movement. And now, it was unstoppable. Shaq had always been a fighter. Whether it was battling for rebounds on the court, building his business empire, or proving doubters wrong, he had never backed down from a challenge. But this was the biggest fight of his life. And the people in power weren't playing fair. The warning that changed everything. It started with a call. Blocked number, no caller ID. Shaq sat alone in his office, staring at his laptop, sifting through reports of the businesses he had exposed. His phone buzzed. He answered. A slow, measured voice came through the line. "You've made your point. Now it's time to walk away." Shaq leaned forward, gripping the phone tighter. "Who is this?" The voice didn't flinch. "Someone who understands business, someone who knows how this works." Shaq stayed silent. "Look, Shaq, you're a smart man," the voice continued. "You know this isn't just about you anymore. You've upset people, powerful people." Shaq exhaled slowly. He knew where this was going. "You have a good life," the voice said. "Your business is thriving. You've got influence, respect. You don't want to ruin that over a fight you can't win." Shaq clenched his jaw. "You don't scare me." A brief pause. Then a chuckle. "Maybe not. But do you really think you're untouchable? Deals fall through. Investors pull out. Sponsors disappear. And if that's not enough, well, let's just say life gets complicated." The call ended. Shaq sat there, his pulse steady, but his mind racing. He had expected backlash. But this was a straight-up threat. And he knew exactly who was behind it. The man behind the curtain, Shaq, had spent the last few weeks tearing down a system that had protected the rich while destroying the working class. And the man sitting at the top of that system? Richard Langston, billionaire. CEO of Langston Holdings, a corporate giant with deep ties to half the industries Shaq had called out. Fast food, security firms, cleaning services, factories. Langston's company didn't just exploit workers. It owned the companies that kept them trapped. And now, Shaq had become his biggest problem. Langston wasn't the kind of man who made headlines. He worked from the shadows, moving money, making deals, controlling industries from behind closed doors. But now, for the first time, someone was threatening his empire. And Langston wasn't going to let that happen. The public backlash. The next morning, Shaq woke up to headlines that felt like a coordinated attack. Shaquille O'Neal is stirring up controversy, but at what cost? Is the NBA legend's activism hurting small businesses? Workers or profits? Shaq's business moves face scrutiny. TV networks brought in economic experts, twisting the narrative. "This isn't about fair wages," one anchor said. "This is about government overreach and celebrities who don't understand business." Shaq flipped the channel. Another panel. Another discussion. Shaq O'Neal is a great businessman, but he's stepping into dangerous territory here. We have to ask, is he really helping or just fueling division? Shaq leaned back on his couch, arms crossed, jaw tight. They weren't just trying to discredit him. They were turning public opinion against him. And it was working. The doubts begin. That afternoon, Shaq met with his inner circle, his business advisors, lawyers, and closest friends. The tension in the room was thick. "You need to stop," one of his advisors said. "Langston's too powerful. He owns the media, the politicians, hell, probably half the companies you're invested in." Another lawyer chimed in. "They're not just coming for your money, Shaq. They're coming for your reputation. You keep pushing and this thing gets ugly." Shaq exhaled through his nose. He could feel the pressure, the weight of everything he had built hanging in the balance. His name, his legacy, his businesses. Was he really willing to risk it all? Then he thought about Bobby, a man who had given his whole life to work, only to be left with nothing. He thought about the janitors, the waitresses, the security guards, people who had worked twice as hard for half as much. Shaq looked around the room, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not stopping." Silence. Some of them nodded. Some sighed in frustration. But no one argued. Because they knew Shaq. And they knew that when he made up his mind, there was no turning back. The people stand with him. As the media storm grew, something unexpected happened. The people started fighting back. Workers from all over the country took to the streets. They held signs. They marched. They refused to be ignored. Stand with Shaq started trending on social media. Former employees of Langston Holdings broke their silence, revealing the truth about the company's exploitative practices. And the biggest shift? Celebrities, athletes, and business leaders started speaking up. Actors, activists, even CEOs who had nothing to gain and everything to lose. Shaq wasn't alone anymore. This wasn't just his fight. It had become a movement. The bold move that no one expected. Shaq knew he had to end this on his terms, and he knew exactly how to do it. That night, he went live on national television. No scripts, no PR team, just him. He looked directly into the camera. "I didn't start this fight because I wanted attention. I started it because people like Bobby Trenton have been ignored for too long." He leaned forward. "There are powerful people out there who want me to back down. They've threatened me. They've tried to discredit me. But here's the thing. I don't scare easy." The tension in the room was electric. Shaq wasn't just talking to the audience. He was talking directly to Langston. "I'm not stopping. Not now. Not ever." Then he made his final move. Shaq reached into his pocket, pulled out a folder, and held it up to the camera. "These are documents from Langston Holdings." The audience gasped. "They show everything. The stolen wages, the illegal contracts, the backdoor deals that keep workers in poverty while billionaires cash in." He tossed the folder on the table. "Tomorrow morning, these files will be sent to every major news outlet in the country. And when they go public, there won't be anywhere left for these companies to hide." A heavy silence filled the room. Shaq's gaze was unshakable. "You wanted me to back down? Too bad. I just went all in." And with that, the broadcast ended. The world held its breath. The next day, the documents were released. Langston Holdings was exposed. The stock market shook. Politicians scrambled. And for the first time, the people in power were the ones who were afraid. Shaq had done the impossible. He had taken on a giant and won. But the fight wasn't over yet. Because now, the whole world was watching. The world had been watching. For weeks, Shaq's fight had dominated headlines. His bold stand against corporate greed, the exposure of Langston Holdings, and his refusal to back down had ignited something unstoppable. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every worker who had been overlooked, underpaid, and discarded. And now, it was time to finish what he started. Taking control. Shaq had always been a businessman, but this was different. Buying struggling businesses before had been a strategy to prove a point. But now, it was a takeover. With Langston Holdings in shambles, Shaq made his move. Piece by piece, he bought out the very companies that had been exploiting workers: fast food franchises, security firms, janitorial services. The same boardrooms that had once dismissed him now had no choice but to answer to him. And the first thing he did? He changed everything. Wages doubled overnight. Healthcare benefits became standard. Retirement plans were guaranteed. Workers who had spent decades being treated like they were disposable were finally being given what they had earned. But Shaq wasn't done. He pushed for new legislation, teaming up with labor rights activists, forcing companies nationwide to end wage theft, stop illegal layoffs, and provide basic protections for their employees. It wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about making sure no one else had to suffer the way Bobby and his people had. Justice for the forgotten workers. One by one, Bobby's people, the janitors, the security guards, the servers, the factory workers, finally started getting what they had been denied for years. Back pay, pensions reinstated, contracts rewritten to protect them. Some cried when they received their first real paycheck. Others simply stared at the numbers, disbelieving. For the first time in decades, they didn't have to choose between rent and food. For the first time in decades, they had dignity. And Bobby? Bobby finally got what he had been fighting for his whole life. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Shaq walked into the shelter where it had all started. Bobby sat at the same old crate he had been using as a table for years. But this time, he wasn't rationing food. He was reading the letter in his hands, his fingers trembling as he traced the words over and over. Retirement, Bobby whispered, almost to himself. A real pension. Backdated pay. Shaq sat across from him, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. You earned it, he said. Bobby blinked, his eyes welling with tears that had been waiting a lifetime to fall. He folded the letter carefully, then looked up at Shaq, his voice thick with emotion. Somebody finally saw us. Shaq felt his throat tighten. Because that's what this had always been about. Not money, not power. Recognition. For Bobby. For the forgotten workers. For every man and woman who had been told they were nothing after giving everything. A changed man, a new beginning. Shaq had started this journey thinking he was just helping. What he didn't realize was that it had changed him too. He had always thought success was measured by how much you made, how much you owned, how much you could give. But now, he understood something deeper. Success wasn't about wealth. It was about who you lifted up with you. As he walked away from the shelter that night, the city lights casting long shadows on the pavement, Shaq knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. What would you have done in Shaq's place? How many Bobby Trentons are out there, unseen, unheard, waiting for someone to notice? The system isn't broken by accident. It's broken by design. The real question is, who's willing to fight back? Drop your thoughts below. The conversation starts here.